Paul Roth. I'm the director of the Ryerson Image Centre. I am very happy to welcome all of you tonight to the Howard and Carol Tanenbaum Lecture Series. Our speaker tonight is Dawoud Bey, whose work is included in our current exhibition season at the Ryerson Image Centre called Power to the People, Photographs and Video of Repression and Black Protest. One of our exhibitions, Birmingham, Alabama, 1963, Dawoud Bey and Black Star, features Dawoud's incandescent portraiture series, Birmingham, 4 Girls, 2 Boys. While the Tanenbaum Lecture Series has had several names in the past, from 1986 to 2013, this continuous series was sponsored by Kodak Canada and known for many years as the Kodak Lecture Series. Through the years, more than 235 photographers, filmmakers, media artists, historians, and curators have addressed Toronto audiences on the Ryerson campus, including such seminal figures as the photojournalist W. Eugene Smith, who was the first speaker, and among many others, Berenice Abbott, Stan Brakhage, William Eggleston, Robert Frank, Sally Mann, Michael Snow, Thomas Struth, and John Sarkovsky. The continuation of this acclaimed and long-standing lecture series was made possible by a gift from Howard and Carol Tanenbaum in 2014. And since then, we have invited to speak Rebecca Belmore, Susan Meiselas, and Isabel Ayur. Dawoud is number 4 in the new iteration of this series. I want to take this opportunity tonight to offer our great thanks to the Tanenbaums for their ongoing generous support, which allows us to continue this series into the future. Before we begin with tonight's lecture, I'd like to note that following the talk tonight, Dawoud and I will have a conversation on stage, and then we will open the floor for a Q&A. Please note that we'll provide a microphone during the Q&A to any audience members who want to ask a question. If you do have a question, please raise your hand, wait till you're called on, and then wait for the microphone to reach you before you speak. This is because we are live streaming tonight's lecture on the internet, and we want you to be heard clearly online. If you would like to encourage any absent friends to follow along with the lecture, please feel free to text them that we have posted a link to the live stream on the Ryerson Image Center website on both the exhibitions page and under the Lectures and Events tab. And of course, feel free to post updates about this event on social media. I'd also like to remind you to mute your cell phones if you have not done so already. A number of people deserve thanks for all that they do in support of the RIC and programs like this one. We have a great team here at the Ryerson Image Center in our galleries, managing our collections and administering our research programs, including not only the staff, but a terrific group of volunteers and docents. And although I can't thank them by name, I would like to thank all of them for making what we do possible. The president of the university, Mohammed Lachimi, and the interim provost and VP academic, Chris Evans, are great leaders of the university and fervent supporters of what we do. We greatly appreciate their stewardship and their support. Our advisory board, chaired by Florence Mins, is extraordinarily generous with time, guidance, and support. I'd also like to acknowledge the continuous support of our mission by the terrific colleagues that we have in the School of Image Arts, led by Chair Blake Fitzpatrick, and also in the Faculty of Communications, Art, and Design, led by Dean Charles Falzon. And finally, our great thanks to the Toronto Star and to CBC Toronto, our media sponsors, for our winter season of exhibitions. As I mentioned at the outset, Dawoud's work is on view as part of our current suite of exhibitions, Power to the People. Power to the People is co-presented by BAND, Black Artists Network Dialogue. For our winter season, the RIC and BAND teamed up to explore the role of photography in documenting and communicating about not only historical but also present-day struggles for justice, particularly engaging the issue of conflict between people of color and police forces representing the state, which of course is a story that continues to this day. I would like to thank our colleagues at BAND, in particular Karen Carter, Julie Crooks, and Reese de Guzman for partnering with us to realize this exhibition season. I do hope that all of you will have the opportunity to see these shows if you haven't already. The exhibition season closes pretty soon on April 9th. To that end, we've actually extended our open hours tonight to 9:30. So if you have time and you're interested after the lecture, there will be a short amount of time that you can visit the galleries tonight. But if not, please come back another day. Power to the People consists of multiple exhibitions. Attica, USA, 1971, Images and Sounds of a Rebellion, which is curated by Philippe Artier with Le Point du Jour in Cherbourg, France. We are the only North American venue for this show. Adam Pendleton's 3-channel video, My Education, a portrait of David Hilliard. This video is presented in collaboration with the Toronto International Film Festival and curated by Andrea Picard. Sisters in the Struggle on our From the Collection wall features portraits of Kathleen Cleaver. This display is curated by Julie Crooks of Band. Julie is also the new assistant curator of photography at the Art Gallery of Ontario. Finally, in our university gallery, we have Birmingham, Alabama, 1963, Dawoud Bey, Black Star. This 2-part exhibition presents 12 portraits by Dawoud commemorating the victims of the 1963 bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. Alongside this artistic act of remembrance is a selection of prints from the Ryerson Image Centre's Black Star collection of photojournalism, which provides historical context for the notorious bombing, recounting not only that event, but also the political and social turmoil that led up to it, placing Birmingham and the American Civil Rights Movement in the international media spotlight during the months prior to the explosion. And now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dawoud Bey. Dawoud began his artistic career in 1975, making a group of photographs called Harlem, USA. This series was exhibited at the Studio Museum in Harlem in 1979 while he was a Cultural Council Foundation CETA artist in residence. Since then, Dawoud has had numerous exhibitions worldwide at such institutions as the Addison Gallery of American Art, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Brooklyn Museum, the Detroit Institute of Arts, the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and in New York City, the Museum of Modern Art and the Whitney Museum of American Art. The Walker Arts Center organized Dawoud's first mid-career survey in an exhibition called Dawoud Bey Portraits, 1975 to 1995. This show was curated by Kelly Jones and traveled to institutions throughout the United States and Europe. Class Pictures, photographs by Dawoud Bey featuring amazing portraits of young people, was published by Aperture Books in 2007 and traveled as an exhibition to U.S. museums through 2011. Then, in 2012, Harlem, USA was published by Yale University Press and exhibited at the Art Institute of Chicago, revisiting this seminal body of work. And at the very same time, his survey exhibition, Picturing People, organized by the Renaissance Society of the University of Chicago, opened on the other side of the city and has since traveled throughout the United States. This marked an unusual and estimable commitment to this Chicago artist's work. Dawoud holds an MFA degree from the Yale University School of Art and is currently professor of art and a distinguished college artist at Columbia College of Chicago, where he has taught since 1998. Dawoud has been honored with numerous fellowships and awards over the course of his long career, including the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship and a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts in the United States, and currently in much danger from political shifting winds, among many, many other awards. Please join me in welcoming Dawoud Bey.
Thank you, Paul, for that wonderful introduction and for the invitation to come here and speak, and also for the inclusion of my Birmingham work in the current exhibition. This is an auspicious moment for me, actually, coming here to Toronto to find myself immersed in significant pieces of my own history. So I'm really happy to be here and to welcome all of you. So, greetings, Toronto. What I'm going to do this evening, something that I find myself increasingly faced with the longer I continue working, is the fact that I've been making photographs for 40 plus years, and I have a few minutes this evening to share my work with you. So the question is always, what do I share with you? And tonight, what I'd like to do is to give you a sense of how I came to making photographs, going back to the beginning, and then to share with you two recent projects, two of my most recently completed projects, as well as a video piece called 9/15/63 that is also a part of the Birmingham work. So to begin, my work as a photographer and the idea of what photographs might mean began in 1969 with a trip that I made to the Metropolitan Museum of Art to see an exhibition called Harlem on My Mind. And I went to see this exhibition not because I was particularly interested in photography, although I had in fact gotten my first camera from my godmother the year before. It was a camera that I had inherited from my godfather, who had passed away. And after the wake, and we were at my godmother's house, before we left, she said, come upstairs with me. I have something I want to give you. And I had no idea what she was going to give me. My young mind was racing with all sorts of possibilities. And we went up to the bedroom, and she opened up the top drawer of a dresser and took out a camera. And she said, this camera had belonged to your godfather, and I want you to have it. I was not interested in photography. I was not pestering my parents to get me a camera. It wasn't like they had conspired with my godmother in this scenario. But for whatever reasons of brilliant intuition, she decided to give me this camera. And having gotten the camera, it certainly piqued my curiosity, made me curious about what I might do with it. Of course, the only problem was it was a real camera, and I didn't know what any of those numbers meant. 125, 160th, 130th, 15th, 4.5, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, 22. I mean, I was just completely baffled, but intrigued. So I began buying photography books and magazines, trying to, first of all, figure this camera out and to figure out what, in fact, I might do with the camera. While I was in the midst of trying to figure that out, this exhibition opened. And I went to see the exhibition, as I said, not because I had been deeply interested in photography. I had only gotten my first camera and hadn't really made anything that you would remotely call a serious photograph. But from a very young age, I had been very socially and politically engaged. working with the Poor People's Campaign when I was in middle school. By high school, I joined the Black Panther Party. I was very active socially and politically. And when the Harlem on My Mind exhibition opened, there was a significant controversy. And we don't have time to go into all of that history, but the fundamental controversy had to do with the question of authorship within the museum space. Who was being allowed to author the visual experience of this African American community. And as a result of that controversy, there were picket lines formed by a group that became known as the Black American Cultural Coalition. And they were protesting basically the fact that Harlem was certainly, by that time, a largely African-American community, and there had been very little significant African-American input or presence in the shaping of that exhibition. So there were protests, and those protests ended up spilling over into the media, talk radio, and newspapers at the time, and I read about this, heard about it, and I wanted to go see, more than anything, what the controversy was about. I can't exactly remember. I may have actually wanted to go get on the picket line. That's probably more likely. But on the day that I got there, finding my way from Queens, New York, to the Metropolitan Museum in Manhattan, I'd never been to a museum on my own before that time. I knew where the Metropolitan Museum was because as a kid growing up in New York, that's one of the places where you go periodically for field trips. So I knew where it was. I didn't exactly know how to get there on my own on the subway. So I got kind of lost a few times. To go to the Met, it's actually, you have to get off at a local stop. I was on the express train. It kept going all the way up to 125th Street. I would get off, go back, it would go down to 59th Street. So finally I got off at 59th Street, for those of you who know New York, Columbus Circle, and walked through Central Park to the museum. And as fate would have it, I guess you could say fate conspired that on the day I showed up, there were no picket lines. And that's what I had come to see, I think. So I decided, okay, go into the museum, go and see the exhibition, which ironically I'm not sure I would have done if the picket lines had been there. But as I said, fate conspired that on the day I showed up, there were no picket lines. So I went into the Metropolitan Museum, my first solo museum visit, completely intimidated. I had no idea where the exhibition was. I was too intimidated to walk up to the information desk and say, excuse me, I'm looking for the Harlem on My Mind exhibition, can you direct? I didn't know where it was. So everybody else walking around in the museum seemed to know where they were going. So I decided, just start walking around. Look like you know where you're going. Just keep your eyes open for a sign that says Harlem on My Mind, and hopefully you'll find it. So I walked through the Egyptian gallery, had a wonderful time there, started my interest in Egyptian art. And eventually I found a sign off to the side that said Harlem on My Mind. And I went up, and it was a transformative experience. Seeing photographs of ordinary African Americans on the wall of a museum, seeing people on the wall of a museum who looked like the people that I knew, began for the first time to give me a sense of what I might do with this camera that I had gotten the year before. And The photographer whose work that I most remembered from that exhibition was James Van Der Zee. And some of you might know James Van Der Zee was an African-American studio photographer who had a studio in 3 different locations in Harlem during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And people in the community would come to Van Der Zee's studio to be photographed. In the course of doing research for the Harlem on My Mind exhibition, a photo researcher by the name of Reginald McGee discovered Van Der Zee's work and included it in this exhibition. But seeing these very formal photographs of African Americans on the wall of the museum and seeing people walking around in the museum looking at these photographs gave me an early sense that this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to make work that would, at some point, end up on the walls of a museum. Of course, I had no idea what that would entail, but it was that exhibition and seeing that work and the possibilities that it opened up for me that was what I would call my beginnings. Along with the Harlem on My Mind exhibition and that initial exposure to James Van Der Zee's work, the other photographer whose work that I came to know during that time was Ward de Carava. Ward de Carava had conspicuously not been in the Harlem on My Mind exhibition. They wanted to exercise more control over Roy's work than he was willing to concede, and so Roy de Carava very publicly and conspicuously declined to be in the exhibition. But I had come across a copy of his book, The Sweet Fly Paper of Life, which was a collaboration of a kind with the writer and poet Langston Hughes, who was a friend of de Carava. They both lived in Harlem. And de Carava had made these photographs in Harlem that he had been trying to get published, which he was unable to get published. And he showed them to Langston Hughes, and Langston Hughes said, well, maybe if I write some text for these photographs, create a kind of fictional narrative around these photographs you've already made, maybe we can shop this around to a publisher. Because by then, Langston Hughes was certainly much more well-known as a published poet and writer than Roy de Carava was as a photographer. And so this book of photographs of ordinary African Americans in Harlem, I came across this book somehow. I guess you can say that you find the things that you need to find when you need to find them, because I don't know, I can't recall how I found this book, but The Sweet Fly Paper of Life and Roy de Carava's work became hugely important to me as well. As well as Gordon Parks's work that I had started seeing in Life magazine. And all 3 of those photographers had made significant work in Harlem. And I have my own significant family history in Harlem, and that my mother and father at one point, just before I was born, lived in Harlem and only left Harlem when I was born in 1953. But I had a family connection to Harlem, and that family connection was recalled through the experience of seeing Harlem on My Mind. And the 2 things together provoked me to want to revisit the community and begin to add something to the visualization of this significant African American community, to make something that would stand in conversation alongside the work of Roy DeCarava, James Van Der Zee, Gordon Parks, and other photographers who had made work there. So my family history combined with that exhibition led me in 1975 to begin my first group of pictures, Harlem, USA. And from 1975 to 1979, I made these formal and somewhat informal portraits of the men, women, and children in that community. I would say that I initially learned how to make photographs by photographing in Harlem over these years. And one of the things that I quickly came to realize was that it was one thing to want to figure out the making of the photographs. It was another thing entirely to figure out the nature of the social relations that would result in those pictures. Because even though my mother and father had at one point lived in Harlem, I didn't. So in some significant way, even though I was African American, I was an outsider in that community. So for several months, I spent time walking around in the community, meeting people, not making photographs, just becoming familiar with the community that I wanted to photograph in, and allowing that community to also become familiar with me. And this photograph of the man in the bowler hat is the photograph that I call the first photograph that I made in Harlem that lived up to or met the level of expectation of what I hoped that I might do. And it was a very difficult photograph for me to make. I saw this man and several of his friends having a conversation one Sunday morning. And as soon as I saw him, I knew I wanted to photograph him. He was kind of, you know, the embodiment of Harlem's past in Harlem's present, looking like it could have been 1930, 1940, this beautifully elegant black man. So I wanted to photograph him. And so as I approached the group, I have to admit I lost my nerve, because I was probably about 19 years old at this time. And I didn't know, how do you interrupt a conversation with four adults to say you want to make a photograph of one of them? Not all of them, just one of them. How do you negotiate that? And that was the moment when I began to realize that the making of the photograph is actually negotiating of a certain social situation. And I actually lost my nerve and just said good morning to all four of them and kept walking. At that point, I'm having this kind of internal conversation with myself. Go back and make the photograph. But how are you going to go back? You already said hello and you kept walking. What are they going to think if you come back? You know, you missed your opportunity. Yeah, you didn't miss the opportunity. This is what you want to do. You have to go back. Should I go back? Should I not go back? I'm having this conversation with myself. So I turn around. I walk back up the block. And I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to do this. So I approached a group of four men. I only made contact with one of them and said, excuse me, would you mind if I make a photograph of you? And he said, fine. What do you want me to do? And that's when I realized the second significant challenge. There's the social situation to negotiate, and then there's the picture maker. And one doesn't tell you, quite frankly, how to do the other. But I had, before this point, been looking at a lot of photographs on my own. I started going to museums and galleries, just looking at pictures. Fortunately, for me, my dad, every Sunday, brought home the New York Times. And for whatever reason, I was drawn to the art section. And in the Sunday art section of the New York Times, there was a listing of exhibitions. And all the way down at the bottom of that listing of exhibitions was something called photography. And there would always only be maybe 1, 2, or 3 photography exhibitions at most. And I started going to those exhibitions. And that's how I came to see the Richard Avedon show in 1976 at Marlborough Gallery, the Mike Disfarmer show at MoMA around the same time, and then back to Marlborough again maybe a year later for the Irving Penn exhibition. So I started looking at a lot of photographs. It was the process of my own, I guess what you might call self-education. So I kind of had an inkling of what kind of photographs I wanted to make. And Harlem on my mind had given me the assurance of who my subjects would be. So I asked the man to just relax and, do whatever you feel comfortable doing. And when I saw this photograph, it reassured me that perhaps I could have a life doing this. That photograph is the photograph that kind of propelled me forward, breaking through the social situation, because I was terribly shy at that moment, terribly shy, to the point where I had a very, very bad stuttering problem that was provoked by situations exactly like that one, having to interrupt 4 adults and say you want to make a picture. So all of that began to disappear with the making of that photograph. So I went on to spend 5 years making these photographs in Harlem. And one of the things that I knew I wanted to do when I had completed that work that reflects back on the initial experience of the Harlem on My Mind exhibition, I knew that I wanted to show the photographs in the community that the photographs had been made in, to give people who were the subjects of the photograph access to the work, to make or allow the subjects to be part of the construct of the audience for the work. Because one of the problematics of the Harlem on My Mind exhibition was the fact that the photographs are made in Harlem, and they were being shown, as it was called then, downtown, in a context that was conspicuously not Harlem. So with that in mind, I knew that I wanted to initially make sure that these photographs were seen by the community that the photographs had been made in. And so I had my first exhibition of this work, which was actually my first solo exhibition anywhere, at the Studio Museum in Harlem in 1979, which marks the beginning of my career as an exhibiting artist. So I'm going to fast forward to a more recent project, Harlem Redux, in which in 2014 I returned to Harlem to make photographs about the ways in which the community was being profoundly changed. Harlem is in the midst of a reshaping of the social space that has largely to do with gentrification. And I wanted to make some photographs about this change as that change was taking place. I wasn't interested in making photographs in the aftermath of that change, but to try to come to terms visually and conceptually with how one visualizes the reshaping of a community as it's being reshaped. So Harlem Redux for me, I call it a visual meditation on change, absence, loss, and memory. And it's also work that is in some ways significantly different from me, because beginning with Harlem, USA, my work is largely centered on the portrait. And this is the first extended project that I've worked on in which the human subject is not the nominal subject of the work, as much as it is the way the physical space is reshaping itself around the presence of those living in Harlem who have lived there, and those living in Harlem who are newly arrived citizens, and how the space of the community is reshaping itself around those two very distinct populations. One of the things that I've been thinking about in relation to this work is the way in which a sense of collective memory is being disappeared. Collective cultural memory and collective spatial memory. When landmarks, places that have defined a place for decades are gone, only to be remembered by that part of the community who was there at the moment that those places existed. And how does one devise a visual and conceptual strategy and language for visualizing this level of profound change and profound reshaping of a community experience? And certainly one of the changes taking place is the reinscribing of a certain set of social relations as new residents move in and old residents are displaced. You know, this photograph here, made outside of Abyssinian Baptist Church, is just one of a few photographs that I've made that engage this issue of tourism in relation to the black churches in Harlem. My family has history at Abyssinian Baptist Church. It's one of the churches that my family used to attend when they lived in Harlem. Abyssinian Baptist Church and a lot of the black churches on Sunday are now disproportionately populated by tourists, because as a community becomes gentrified and those who have been living there are pushed out, the congregations are dwindling in these churches as well. And there's a whole marketing campaign around tourism and the black church. Most of them tag themselves the opportunity to have the experience to witness an authentic black gospel church service. To witness it, not to participate in it, but to witness it. I have to say, you know, someone who has a long history of this community, it's quite unsettling. I won't go into it too much at this point, but a couple of Mother's Days ago, when I attended service at Abyssinian, it looked like the church had reached the tipping point, because there were clearly more tourists in the church than there were a congregation. And what that means and what that forebodes for the future of Harlem is, I guess, an open question. But for me, it was about trying to make some kind of resonant visualization of this shift that's taken place in the community. So I'm pretty much completed with this project. It's going to be one of the chapters in a book that I'm currently working on. I'm also in the midst of working on what's going to be an exhibition of the Harlem, USA work and the Harlem Redux work that's going to travel together so that I can create this conversation between Harlem's past and Harlem's very recent present. And stepping back a couple of years before the recent Harlem work, to talk about the Birmingham Project. One day in 1964, my mother and father went to hear James Baldwin speak at our church. And after Baldwin spoke, there was a reception and an event, and a representative from Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was there selling this book, The Movement. I didn't attend that talk with my mom and dad, but they came home with this book. And my father spoke a little bit about what Baldwin had said, not too much, but he made it a point to leave this book in a very conspicuous place so that I could get a look at it. He probably figured that was a better tactic than telling me I had to get a look at it. Because if he had told me I had to get a look at it, maybe I would have just kind of pushed it aside. But he just left it on the table in the living room. And this book basically was a book of photographs. Many of the photographs from this book are actually in the current exhibition here at the Ryerson Image Centre. And they were photographs of, I guess what you could say was a lot of the things that my mother and father had tried to shield me from up until that moment. Some of the photographs, there were lynching photographs in that book. There were photographs of and about the civil rights movement. And the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had gathered up the photographs and approached Lorraine Hansberry and asked her if she would write a text for the photograph so that it could be published as a book, which she did in a very short period of time. But of all of the photographs in the book, the one that seared itself most deeply into my psyche was this photograph of a young Sarah Jean Collins. And it's the kind of photograph, for me, you know, my life can be marked as my life before this photograph and my life after. That's how profoundly I was struck by this photograph. I don't know that I fully intuited at that moment that I was more or less the very same age as the young girl in the photograph. But I just knew that this photograph of this vulnerable and wounded young black girl was a photograph that once I saw it, I never forgot it. I moved it around to different parts of my mind and my psyche, but at one point it was right here. And over the years, I never forgot this photograph. And Sarah Jean Collins was the sister of Addie Mae Collins, one of the 4 girls who was killed in the dynamiting of the 16th Street Baptist Church. And Sarah Jean Collins was also in the girls' room when the dynamite went off. She was further away from the blast, so she was not killed. Her sister and the other 3 girls who were standing right next to the wall on which, directly on the other side, the dynamite had been placed, so they caught the full brunt of the explosion. But she was wounded, lost sight in one eye, and was certainly severely traumatized by the incident. Without going into great detail, most people know about the 4 girls, but there were in fact 16 people who were wounded in that blast, including Sarah Mae Collins, who was closest to the explosion. But at some point in early 2000, now I first saw that photograph when I was 11 years old. And at some point, some 12, 13 years ago, you know this expression, to sit bolt upright in bed? I never really knew what it meant. I know what it means now. Because one morning, I was lying in bed, and then as if somebody had smacked me on the back of the head, I sat bolt upright, and this image came back. It just came right back. Whatever it was that dislodged it, whether someone had said something, whether I had seen something, I don't recall. But this image came right back. I had placed it back here. It came right back to the forefront. And at that point, I knew, without having any sense of what I might do, I knew that I needed to go to Birmingham. I knew that I had to respond to that. This thing that I had been pushing to the side ever since I saw that photograph when I was 11 years old. I didn't know anyone in Birmingham at that time, but as I had been doing since 1993, all of the projects and works that I've made since 1993 have been done as part of an extended institutional collaboration, either a residency or a residency project that I devised with a museum. So museums, for me, over all those years, have become kind of like my laboratories. They're not only the place where I show my work, but they're very often the places through which I make my work. And so I started looking to see who I might contact in Birmingham, and the only institution I came across was the Birmingham Museum of Art. So I got in touch with the Birmingham Museum of Art, the curator there at the time, and told him that I had an idea to make some work, which is kind of how all my projects start. I have an idea, would you like to talk to me about it? And he said, sure, let's get together. I think we had a meeting initially in Chicago. And I started to think about it some more because, quite frankly, I didn't know what to make or do in response to that dramatic and traumatic history. I didn't just want to go there and make photographs of the place where it had happened. But I started making trips to Birmingham to familiarize myself with the place that I wanted to make work in. I needed to see what Birmingham, which was a place of my imagination that was rooted in the dramatic events of 1963. I needed to see what Birmingham was. And so I started making trips to Birmingham, just making photographs, visual notes, meeting people, beginning to build relationships there. I would go back home and think about it some more. I would hear from someone in Birmingham. We haven't heard from you for a while. Are you still interested in working on that project we talked about last year? Oh, still very interested. Why don't you come back and have another conversation with us? That went on for 7 years as I built relationships, kept those conversations going for 7 years. And finally, because mind you, over those 7 years, the curator that I initially had spoken to had moved on to another position. So I was having conversations with different people. And they would come, oh, I saw that file in my desk. You were here a few years ago. Are you still interested? I said, I'm still interested. I'm trying to figure this out because I don't feel it's my place to just come there and make some work. So at some point in those conversations, the director of the Birmingham Museum got in touch with me and said, you know, we've been talking about this for a while. And 2013 is going to be the 50th year of this moment that we have been talking about. And it seems to me that if we're ever going to do this, that seems to be when we should do it. And that obviously felt more right than any other time. The 50th year, 2013, 50 years from that moment. So at that point, with a date more firmly in mind and a commitment from the museum, I started doing research, trying to dig as deeply into the history of that moment and the moments surrounding it as I could. I started spending time in the archive of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, looking at newspapers from that day, looking at the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth collection. For those of you who don't know, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth was an activist minister in Birmingham. Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, I would say in Birmingham, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth is probably the person who was most at the center of the movement in Birmingham. And I started doing research, and it was in the course of doing that research that I found out that not only 4 girls had been killed that day, but 2 boys had been killed in the aftermath of the bombing that morning. These 2 boys, Johnny Robinson and Virgil Ware. Johnny Robinson, after the dynamiting of the 16th Street Baptist Church that morning, people were restless. The community was out in the streets. White folks in Birmingham were riding around, waving the Confederate flag, celebrating what had happened that morning. And police said they saw 16-year-old Johnny Robinson throwing rocks at a car with some people riding around, whooping it up, waving the Confederate flag. And they called to him. He walked off that way, and the police shot him in the back. They killed Johnny Robinson right there in the streets of Birmingham. Virgil Ware was riding on his bicycle with his brother. They had just finished delivering the Sunday newspapers the day of the bombing. And they actually didn't know the bombing had happened. They were a little bit outside of downtown Birmingham. And they had the misfortune to cross paths with 2 white teenagers who had come from what could be called a pep rally that had been held in the immediate aftermath of the explosion. The pep rally had been called by the Klan and the White Citizens Council. And these two young teenagers left the pep rally pumped up. They wanted to add something to this. So one of them went home, got his little pistol out of the shoebox, riding around, looking for somebody. And they encountered the two Ware brothers. And one of the white teenagers, it was two white teenagers on a little motor scooter, two black teenagers on a bicycle, crossing paths. And one of the white teenagers took his pistol out, pop, pop, and shot Virgil Ware right off of the bicycle. And Virgil Ware died in his brother's arms. So once I knew about those two young African-American boys, I knew that I had to bring them into the shape of this project, that the work that I wanted to do was actually about the four girls and these two boys. So I decided to make work in two different locations. The first location is Bethel Baptist Church, which was the home church of Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth. It's kind of where the civil rights movement was born. The Southern Christian Leadership Council was formed in Bethel Baptist Church. So I wanted to embrace the kind of black communal space of the black church as one location. And the second location that I wanted to make photographs of was in the Birmingham Museum of Art itself. The Birmingham Museum of Art, of course, back at that time, was yet another among many segregated institutions, and black people could not visit the Birmingham Museum of Art, except on one day that was set aside, a day called Negro Day, and they could only visit the museum on Negro Day if some other white people had not decided they wanted to visit the museum on that day. So I wanted those two pieces of history to wrap itself around the subjects. And why do I feel like this microphone is? Well, anyway. So Bethel Baptist Church became one of the locations, and the Birmingham Museum became the second location. And I decided, you know, what I was trying to figure out was how does one make work about something that has already happened? How does one visualize the past in the contemporary moment? And how does one make tangible and palpable the lives of those 6 young black people who had been killed? So I decided to make photographs of young African-American girls who were the ages of the 4 girls who were killed. One of them was 11, the other 3 were 14, and the 2 boys who were killed, Virgil Ware, who was 13 and 16. And then as a way of envisioning both the passage of time and to evoke the lives that they were never allowed to live, I decided to also make photographs of African Americans in Birmingham who were the ages that they would have been, and then to pair these photographs that have been made individually into diptychs, and each diptych would in fact embody 50 years. So a call went out on a number of different platforms, everything from putting flyers up in the barbershop and beauty parlors and the greasy spoons and just hanging out everywhere, doing school visits, letting people know that I was doing this project and that I specifically wanted to make photographs of African Americans in Birmingham who were those exact ages. Not approximately, because to resonate for me, those young people had to be 11 and 14, 13 and 16, to make visible what does an 11-year-old black girl look like. She looks like this. What does a 13-year-old black boy look like? He looks like this. So, working over several months in both of those locations, people were invited and they responded to come and sit for these photographs. Most of the people that I photographed did not know each other. They were all photographed at different times. I made the pairings of subjects after the fact based on age and based on the sometimes almost intangible sense of relationships that I saw between them, whether gestural, psychological, dispositional, or in some cases physical. Taking my cues from one in terms of which other to pair that with. So altogether, in the final selection of work, there were 16 diptychs, 32 subjects that were chosen from among the ones that I made. One of the things that was interesting about the locations, and everyone knew the context in which the work was being made. When I first started inviting people to come to the Birmingham Museum of Art to be photographed, the first time it happened, I was a little confused because I was waiting. They weren't there. And then I would have my assistant call, "Where are you?" And they would say, "I'm there. We're here." I'm like, "You're here?" "Well, I'm here. Where are you?" "We're at the museum." I said, "What museum?" "You know, the museum, the Civil Rights Institute." I said, "Oh, that's interesting." You know, because if you're an adult who grew up at a time when you couldn't even legally go to the Birmingham Museum of Art, why would you think when I said come to the museum that that's the museum it would be? Now, people were intuitively going to the museum. It just wasn't the museum that I was in. And once I realized that, I started being more explicit, because even though I gave them the address, the location, a few people would instinctively, you know, this must be happening at the Civil Rights Institute. It can't be happening at the Birmingham Museum. But indeed it was. And for a number of them, even without having had the conversations, I could tell when they walked in that they hadn't been in the museum before. They would come in looking around. And you can tell when somebody's having an initial experience of a place. And for a number of them, this was indeed the first time that they had set foot inside of the Birmingham Museum. But of course, that's exactly why I wanted to make the photographs there, to make that institutional space an accessible space, to make a space that was once off limits, not only a place where they could come to be photographed, but on whose walls these photographs were at some point going to hang. So after several months of making this work, on September of 2013, exactly 50 years to the day of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, the exhibition opened at the Birmingham Museum of Art. That work has since gone on to be shown at other institutions as well. And from that body of work, a couple of years ago, I got together with my gallery in Chicago, Stephen Data Gallery, and published the portfolio. That portfolio is Birmingham, 4 girls and 2 boys. And that's the work that you see here at the Ryerson Image Centre. So let me close with a video. The video is called 9/15/63, as in September 15th, 1963. And it's a meditation on that morning, a way of thinking about that morning in the past that's rooted in history, but to visualize it in the contemporary moment. And I'm not going to say too much about it. I'm sure Paul may have some questions, so I can amplify some of what you'll see in this video. Can we bring these lights all the way off? Thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Hello.
Hello. Thank you, Dawoud. That was amazing. Before we start, I'd like to apologize to those of you who might have heard there's a bit of a buzzing coming from a speaker, unanticipated. I hope it's not obscuring your experience tonight. I wanted to start before we really get into it by pointing out that at least for part of this talk, and maybe for the entire talk, maybe he's still here, is the gentleman that you first talked to at the Birmingham Museum of Art, the person who agreed to that commission. David Mose is here tonight. David.
There you are. I'm going to come down off stage for a minute. How you doing?
I'm good.
His son was born in Birmingham.
That's right.
Wow. Yeah, that was the first conversation. Yeah. Okay.
And then it was interesting.
Maybe you remember exactly when it was. I said early 2000s. I mean, I honestly can't remember, but it was early 2000s.
Yeah, a long gestation. I know that when I first talked to David about it, it struck me because he said, you know, I originally was in on that commission. I commissioned Dawoud, but I was gone long before it happened. And that was my first clue about how long it took. I didn't realize.
Yeah. You know, when I'm doing projects with museums now, that's kind of like my benchmark. I say, it's gonna take some time, but it's not gonna take 8 years. But it's, you know, but
Yeah.
I don't know that I could have done that work before then, because by the time I began the Birmingham work, I had just come to know so much about the history, you know, and what I realized, and we spoke about this early, you know, there's, you know, the history that most of us know is actually the mythic history. It's kind of been tidied up. It's in a straight line. This happened, that happened, and therefore this happened. And history is actually much more complicated and a lot messier than that. And from all the years spent in Birmingham, I came to realize just how complicated the history was that I thought I knew, including on my first visit. You know, when I first visit, my first visit was to the Birmingham, you know, the church where this had happened, the 16th Street Baptist Church. And I figured I had to go there first. I had to go to the place where this happened. I needed to see it so I could know what it is, not what it was. And I went, and it was the first real eye-opening experience that I had in Birmingham, because I had a sense of what it might be. It's a Black Baptist church. I actually grew up in the Black Baptist church. I thought it was going to be a rollicking congregation. The church was going to be full. And that first visit, I would say the church was about 3/4 empty, actually. So that was the first thing that took me back, that the church wasn't a very thriving congregation. And then after the service, as I was going out, the minister was at the back door, probably with 1 or 2 of the deacons, greeting people as they left. And I just shook his hand, introduced myself, because come on now, you don't go to somebody's house without introducing yourself. That's just the way I was raised. So I spoke to him, and I said, I'm an artist from Chicago. I just wanted to meet you, just wanted to say hello. I'm thinking about coming back here to do some work. He said, oh, really? Really? What do you do? I said, I'm a photographer, and I'm thinking about coming back to make some work about that moment, September 15th, and before I could even get the year out of my mouth. He said, you just stop right there. Let me tell you something. And I'm polite. I'm keeping a straight face. And the minister told me, he said, here at 16th Street Baptist Church, we're not about all that business. He said, we're about the business of Jesus Christ. And he said, if you want to make some work about that, we'd be happy to work with you. And I shook his hand. Of course, my head is spinning, right? But because I'm like, you're not about that business. What other business is there? That's the business that I shook his hand and left, realizing that the thing I wanted to do, or the history that I thought I was engaging, was much more complicated than what I thought.
To me, that's one of the most fascinating things about the project, because the project, I think if any of us tried to conceive how would one do a portraiture project on that subject, we would come up wanting. Portraiture is one of, I think still, maybe even more today than ever, one of the least understood genres of art making, particularly when it deals with subjects beyond the subject in the frame.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that's fascinated me about your project since I first saw it is the fact that it's effectively a series of portraits of missing lives, of the passage of time that did not occur, the space between the young subject and the older subject in each picture is the length of the life that was not lived for those 4 little girls and for the 2 boys. And I'm curious, you've said 7, 8 years of thinking. That story that you've just mentioned is a person, in effect, challenging you to think carefully about what it is that you wanted to do.
To rethink. And the other layer of meaning for the project for me, in addition to it being a kind of memorial to those 4 girls and 2 boys, the lives that were lost, the lives that were never lived. It's also a portrait of contemporary African-American Birmingham, because all of the people in the photographs live in Birmingham. So it functions at that level too. But it is initially a way of visualizing these lost lives. And how do you talk about time, the passage of time, absence in the still photograph? And one of the things for me, it was a very at times emotionally trying project because I wanted to give a tangible presence to those young lives, but thinking about those 6 young people who were killed, and then seeing an 11-year-old girl come walking in. See? 11 is very young, probably even younger than we imagine. And my heart would catch. An 11-year-old girl would walk in, and I would imagine that girl. But for a different time, it could have been her. It was a very, I had to go home and come back and go home and come back because it was very, emotionally weighing. It weighed on me to imagine the same thing happening to these young people that I was photographing. And all of them were aware of it too. As I was doing school visits, looking for subjects, I would ask them, who knows what happened on September 15th, 1963? And they know. They know that history. Looking at the work from the other side, the adults who are the ages that those young people would have been, Some of them knew those young people because that's the age they were. Some of them remember hearing the blast that morning. You know, so they were present. It was them. For the older people, it was them. It was their family. It was their friends. And a number of them knew those young people, which makes perfectly good sense because they would have been the same age. They would have been at the same schools, and they were part of the same community.
What were the sessions like? Did you talk about what your idea was, about how you wanted things to work? Did you direct them?
I do all of the talking before and after I make the photographs. I say very little during the actual making of the photographs because I need to create a very quiet, contemplative space. I'm not talking, hoping that they do something in response to something that I say. I don't know how to make that kind of photograph or that kind of portrait. Maybe there is a way to do that. But what I try to do is to be present, but to kind of absent myself from the process as well, to just give them a contemplative space to sit and think in and to be witnessed. There's a certain amount of directing on my part, but that directing usually takes its cues from the person's behavior. So for me, it's just sit down, make yourself comfortable. They'll sit down, and they'll do something interesting like this. Like these are the things that I'm acutely aware of, people's gestural behaviors. The thing that I can't make up. Yeah, and then they'll do something like that, which is a slight variation. They have to be fully present, which is all that I ask of the person, is that they be fully present. But in terms of the gestural and the behavioral things, I try to create a quiet enough, comfortable space so that they are able to fall into their own behaviors. And then I shape that behavior to the immovable rectangular space of the picture. You know, like if the arms are out too far, I would just say, I love what you're doing with your hands, just bring your elbows in. I don't tell them why. I don't need to know why. And as long as they're still comfortable, because I'm making a photograph. So it's about the experience, it's about the relationship, but ultimately it's about the making of the photograph.
When people were being photographed for the series, did they know that they would be paired with another person?
Yeah, I told them, and I told them I didn't know with who. I was making instant print as I went along. Back in the day, it would have been Polaroid, but now it's Fuji Instant. So I was making instant prints and playing around with the pairs in between, photographing them, being mindful that because I knew I was going to pair them and make diptychs, a certain number of people had to sit on the left and a certain number of people had to sit on the right. And if I got a really strong portrait of a woman sitting on the left, if a young girl came in that I thought, I might be able to pair this with that person, I would definitely have her sit on the right. So I was trying to imagine the shape of the work, even as I was making it. And none of them were ever together in the church or the museum at the same time. And they never saw the pairs until they came to the opening at the museum in September 2013.
Do you, and this question could go more broadly for all of your portraiture, do you think that any of the subjects, knowing what you were doing, knowing that they would be paired, knowing that they were representing a missing life, do you think any of them helped make the picture in effect, that they helped you along to that picture in a way beyond normal posing?
Some of them do. You know, they realize without understanding the full implications of it, because I don't know that anyone fully knows what it would look like to see yourself in a dramatically Rembrandtish lit 32 by 40 black and white print hanging on the wall of a museum. I don't think there's any way to fully explain that. You just have to see that. But they know that the reason that I'm there is to give them an expanded presence in the world through my work. You know, that I just kind of lay that out. They ask me, what are you doing? I said, well, you know, I believe in making work with people through the work that I do, giving them an expanded presence in the world through the museum space, because that's the space that I work in. That's the space that I always imagined my work existing in. The museum as a place of ideas, the museum as a place of history, the museum as a public institution, how to make it an increasingly public space by introducing other publics into the conversation, not only of the audience, but as part of the very objects that are on the wall in that institutional space.
One thing that's interesting to me about your work, and there may be some of you who haven't seen a variety of the different bodies of work that Dawoud has done, but one thing that he has done at different moments in his career and that he's still doing is pairing and doubling and tripling his images to try to say something a bit further than a single image might say. You still make formal single images, but I'll never forget when I first saw your large Polaroid portraits where you might show 2 or 3 images of one person. And then at a certain point I realized that again and again I was seeing portraits by you of 2 people together before this project as well. And now just looking at the difference between Harlem, USA and Harlem Redux, I started to think about how that's going to look when you pair those 2 shows and you see people portrayed in one series and those people missing in the next series. And I'm curious how that...
Well, for me, it's partly about pushing against the presumed limitation of the still photograph that we tend to think of as being one moment. And wanting to figure out, as someone who's engaged in a conversation not only with the world and the subject, but who's also engaged in a conversation with the medium and its history. What else can a photograph be? You know, how can a photograph be extended so that it visualizes this moment and whatever the next moment in your behavior is going to be? Why do they have to be 2 separate photographs? Why can't they, in fact, coexist as one photograph that opens up the notion of time within the still photograph, opens up the idea of multiple psychological representations in the still photograph, and with the really large-scale Polaroids that are different parts of the subject to investigate the way in which we actually construct a sense of the person that we're looking at. Because when we're looking at someone, we don't take it in at a whole glance. I'm looking at your face. I'm not looking at your feet. You know, in order to get a sense of you in your entirety, I have to do this, and I have to look at your hands, I look at that foot, and now I know what you look like. You know, so the photographs are about that, finding a formal and material way to visualize the way we actually go about reading a subject, glance by glance, piece by piece, in order to construct a whole. That's a piece of it, because also in getting closer, you know, you're amplifying, you know, the descriptive quality of the thing you're looking at and monumentalizing it in a way. And the scale ends up becoming more emblematic of the scale that we usually associate not with photographs, but with historical painting in terms of the enhanced physical description and scale in which the person is represented. So for me, you know, the Polaroid work was about all these multiple overlapping agendas, and then bringing all of those ideas to bear primarily on the young teenage subject to suggest the complexity of a subject that I think is very often essentialized.
You and I earlier today, we were talking about the common perception that portraiture is about capturing the soul of a person. And it's such an interesting idea that people have, and I think it helps people understand portraiture in a way. And there's some truth in it, but of course, there's a lot that's not true.
I've had people say this to me: "I love your work, when I look at it, I can see his soul. I understand what they're saying. It's not what I do. You know, I have been engaged in metaphysics, but those metaphysics don't necessarily extend to picture making. And I don't think that a photograph has the capacity to do that. I understand from my standpoint that what they're talking about is the appearance of a deep interiority. And for most people, you know, a lot of people describe that as the soul. But in all of my work, I want to describe both a heightened sense of the material surface of the person, what people physically look like, but I always want the photographs to also have a deep sense of interiority, that there is a rich, full, complicated person underneath the interior. And that quality of deep interiority, introspection, I think is the thing that people are describing when they say, I can see their soul. You're able to feel that you're looking at a whole, full, rich person because there's an interior quality to the work.
Yeah. I'm just going to ask one more question before we open it up to the audience. You mentioned the opening in Birmingham and that many of your subjects were there. Who else came? Did you invite, for example, the people from the 16th Street Baptist Church who had said, you know, that's not our business?
I'm not going to sit here and talk about everything, but no, because there was an interesting series of relationships because the minister, for example, of Bassel Baptist Church, he embraced the project immediately. And the church that I ended up photographing in is the restored Bethel Baptist Church. It's the church that Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth preached in. They have since built a new sanctuary, but they were in the midst of doing an historic restoration of Bethel. And when I first met with the minister, whose name I'm trying to think of even as I sit here on stage, he understood immediately what it was I wanted to do. And he said, you know, we're fixing up the original sanctuary. He said, if you want to use that, you know, I will make it available to you whenever you need. And it was, I can't even describe the experience because I was the first one to use that church. You know, the church where it all began pretty much. And, you know, the interesting thing about, you know, 16th Street Baptist Church, without going into a lecture about that history, is that 16th Street Baptist Church, all of the mass meetings that were held at 16th Street Baptist Church, those meetings that were called largely by Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and others, and then Martin Luther King Jr. and Abernathy would come in. But those mass meetings at 16th Street Baptist Church were actually populated by the congregation from Bethel Baptist Church, First Congregational, and smaller churches around Birmingham. The reason that they met at 16th Street Baptist Church was because it was centrally located and it was large enough to hold the numbers of people who would come to those mass meetings. But none of the people at the mass meeting were the congregation of 16th Street Baptist Church. And I would imagine most people would think that it was. Who else would it be? And the ministers from 16th Street Baptist Church were not present at those meetings. They made the church available. And even when they made the church available, in order to create a little bit of distance, the minister at 16th Street Baptist Church would always instruct the church secretary to please send Dr. King a bill for $2.32 for the electricity that they used that last night at the meeting. And it's a very complex history because it doesn't mean they didn't want to be there. You know, there were distinct class differences in the congregations of 16th Street Baptist Church and Bassel and First Congregational. And quite frankly, showing up at those meetings could get you killed. They could and would get your house bombed. I mean, all sorts of things would happen if you had the kind of job where on Sunday morning or Monday morning you went to work and somebody said, did I hear you was at that foolishness at 16th Street Baptist Church last night? And you needed to be able to say, no, I wasn't there. If you were a postal worker, a teacher, or anyone who, in all likelihood, had a white supervisor, you needed to be able to say you were not there. Maybe you wanted to be there, but you were not there. And I know we're going a ways off of your question, but a number of people from Bethel Baptist Church are subject in the photograph. The minister of Bethel came, congregation came, and I did go by and speak to the minister of 16th Street Baptist Church after, but they were not active participants. And as the 50th year approached, the question about how was 16th Street Baptist Church going to participate in the commemoration of the 50th year became an interesting question throughout Birmingham, because this was the place where it happened. And they ultimately did participate, but they felt very strongly about maintaining the control of the narrative of what the church is. And when I saw the minister after my opening, I had a brief conversation with him, you know, and I just needed to let him know that I understood. I said, Reverend, I understand. This is not the museum of September 15th, 1963. It's a church, and you got work to do. You got people to save here, you know. So we had that conversation, but they have for a very long time, other than the tours that they do, tried not to get too wrapped up in the narrative that a lot of people think is the only narrative. But as far as Bassel goes and all the folks from Reverend Fred's church, they were all full in. Complicated history.
Very, very. So we're going to open it now for a few questions. Does anyone want to ask any questions? I think we have somebody right over here. This gentleman.
Hello. Is this working?
Yes.
Fascinating work this evening. You inspired me.
Well, thank you.
And it reminded me of something about telling the sacred story. Who has the right to do that? Maybe that's what the minister was saying. This is something sacred. So Dana Schultz's painting of Emmett Till. I was 2 years old when Emmett Till was killed. His mother made the decision to keep his casket open. We all know what happened after that. Now there's a biennial at the Whitney, not in Mississippi. And there's a protest going on. I'm thinking about how you opened up.
I know all about it.
So,
let me hear your question.
And so my question is, if someone in this audience had a stand-up boat moment after listening to you, regardless of their race, ethnicity, they had that moment. They were inspired. Would they have the right? That's what this question is. It says, it is not acceptable for a white person to transmute black suffering into profit and fun. That's the criticism. But this is art.
You're not a Facebook friend of mine, are you?
No. I'm just here.
This conversation is happening all over social media.
I want, if you could speak to that, given the diversity of this space.
Oh, man, it's an interesting issue. How many of you are aware of this conversation that's raging right now about the Emmett Till painting by Dana Schultz at the Whitney Biennial? And there's an open letter that went out to the director and the curators of the biennial, asking that the piece not only be removed, but to be destroyed. Now, I don't know that, well, first of all, as an artist, I can never condone censorship of another artist's work. That's first and foremost. I certainly cannot condone the destroying of an artist's work. That's something that, if you look at what ISIS has been doing in certain parts of the world, you know, destroying ancient, just trying to wipe history out. So I do not, you know, as somebody who lived through the culture wars, you know, if you're going to choose to censor someone's work, you know, you may be next in line. You know, there might be someone who decides that Dawoud Bey, he's exploiting September 15th, 1962. He's using those poor children to profit. You know, he should never be able to. I don't know where the committee that makes those decisions reside. Actually, fortunately, there is no such committee. But that controversy, at the very least, raises an interesting set of questions. Part of what is so interesting about that controversy, and I tried to provoke it by putting something up on my page this morning. There's another painting in the Whitney Biennial show by Henry Taylor, who's an African-American artist from LA. And that painting shows, let me see, Castillo, Philando Castillo, who was killed sitting in the car while his wife, the only thing she could do was to put that iPhone up and bear witness to what was happening. And the police basically shot him, almost point blank, while he was sitting in his car with his wife, and killed him. And that painting is also in the Whitney. Two paintings that both visualize and represent violent, traumatic, black death, deadly assaults on the black body, deadly assaults on the black male body. And I think that both of those paintings are part of a very deeply related and connected conversation. Paul and I were talking about this earlier. I think one of the things that will definitely come out of this controversy is that people will definitely go back and look for that Emmett Till photograph. I can't imagine everyone who knew about the controversy had ever seen that photograph. And I think the question of whether there is subject matter that should never be the subject matter for the making of an art object, I just think that's going to have to remain an open question. You know, but I would never be a signature on an open letter calling for the censorship of another artist, let alone calling for that artist's work to be destroyed. So no, I don't agree with it.
Up here.
Hi, I have a much more modest question. You mentioned that you made 16 diptychs memorializing these 6 victims.
More, but there were 16 in the finished group, 32 people.
So how do those correlate, if you will, to the 6 victims that you're remembering?
What was that again? I missed the end of that question.
You were
16
memorializing 6 victims, 4 girls and 2 boys. You made 16 diptychs. Where's the
16.
1-6, right? Where is the correlation?
I think
I'm missing
she's asking why you didn't just photograph 6 people. Why didn't you just photograph 4?
Or 12, you know, 6
Yeah,
diptychs.
so that you would match up with.
Well, let me make a distinction if this is what you're asking. There's the larger project, and then there is the portfolio. These 6 diptychs that are hanging here, those come out of that larger project. I wanted to do, it's part of my history. I came of age in the 70s, loving Paul Strand's Mexico portfolio. I appreciate the opportunity to bring together a small group of works to put them together as a group in a box, to collect them, to have a representation of a larger body of work, which in this case matches the configuration of the moment itself, in which 4 girls and 2 boys were killed. But there's the larger project. There could have been more, except that I had some individual photographs that I couldn't find a second photograph to go with. And each photograph was only useful if it had a pair. And I was also, as I made the work, I'm conscious of where the work is going to go. I was thinking about the space that it was going to inhabit. I thought that those 16 diptychs would hold the space of the museum that they were being made to be shown for the first time. So I always think about the work in relation to the context as well, trying to see what it's going to be, trying to imagine what it's going to be. So the larger work was imagining the work as a large group of museum wall-based objects. And then the second piece of it was to have a representative group of those with a box. Maybe we should have the box on display too, because it's a beautiful presentation. I had a handmade box. There's a colophon. There's the whole putting together of the portfolio almost as an object in and of itself. The 6 diptychs being shown here come out of that box and onto the wall from that context.
I think we just have time for 2 more questions. This gentleman here.
That was excellent. I really enjoyed it. I'm a political scientist, so one of the things that you said that really jumped out at me was your attentiveness to social relations when you are photographing an individual or a situation. And I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about that, and maybe in general what you think the relationship is between politics and photography in general.
Let me take a drink.
Only big questions tonight.
The relationship of politics to photography from my own subjective standpoint as an artist, because I think my work is an extension of who I am in the world. My work is an extension of my own history, my own social and political history, going back to that initial experience of seeing that girl in the book, and believing that part of the mission of the work is to make work that responds in some resonant yet poetic way to that. I never want to make didactic work. I want to make work that is simultaneously socially engaging, that comes out of a very meaningful social context, but also engages very meaningful with the visual poetics of what a photograph is. You know, so both of those things are equally as important to me. For me, it's always important that I begin with the context. You know, if I'm going to be in Birmingham, I'm not going to just go there and make some work. You know, there has to be some real integrity in the quality of engagement, and the work comes out of that. Both in terms of the relationship, but also my ability to work fluidly in that context, because I feel that I'm deeply committed to it. I know a lot more about the place than most people who are not from there. I have a series of real relationships there. And all of that, for me, is the foundation on which the work begins. My engagement with the world visualized in some way, and then to think about the context in which that work can be placed to make it resonate even further. Like, it was particularly important that the Birmingham work first be shown at the Birmingham Museum of Art. Much the way, and that's kind of been the way I've thought about it from the beginning. Much the way it was important that the work made in Harlem be shown in Harlem. That people not only be the subjects and then the work is shown in some other place, which sometimes has the tendency to exoticize the subject by turning them into an other. For me, it's important for the work to be rooted in a community and for that community to also participate in its own visualization in some conspicuous way. So that, to me, is as much a social commitment as it is a commitment to a certain kind of art practice. And it also doesn't preclude my deep engagement with the entire history of the medium that I've chosen to work in, that I think gives me the kind of the fluidity to do whatever I need to do once I'm behind the camera looking at the world through a lens. Because looking at the world through a lens is very different from, let's say, visualizing Emmett Till in a casket through paint. It's different. Both have their own expressive capacities, but it's different. And the work that I make is always an extension of my own ideas about the subject. And I like to tell people look the way they do in my photographs because I made them. The same subject in someone else's photograph, it probably look very different. They're an extension of my idea about the subject. Do I ever say that to the person? No, it's not necessary. But my quality of engagement, the fact that I don't speak, because I could try to say something funny and make them laugh and show how upbeat humanity is. That's not my shtick. That's not what I do. You know, I'm trying to make something resonant that, you know, gives a sense that ordinary people have very rich interior lives. If you want to call that political, I'll sign on it.
Okay. Let's see.
I have two questions. One I think will be quick and the other one might be not so. The first is about your reference to the process and how, if anything, there might have been different with the children, because it struck me as you talked about the 11-year-old walking in and whether or not you were different. I always think dealing with children is different, and so how, as the artist with them, you may have done things a bit differently, because they seemed almost like family. When I looked at the images, their sense that interior seemed similar in some way. So if there was anything you did that you felt made the children relax into themselves differently than the adults. And then the other piece is the 7 years. What were you thinking about when you went back? But it wasn't it wasn't the right fit. What was maybe your process? Was it really just about the date coming to you, or was there a process that you may have been figuring out this in that 7-year window from the initial meeting to when the work became real?
I got the first part about is there anything I tell them, or how do I?
No, remember you said you would go to Birmingham, and you do some research, you take some time, but then you weren't ready yet, and the directors changed at the museum. So from the first meeting to when you got the call from the director saying, "You've been talking about this."
We've been talking about this for 6, 7 years. How long was it? I'm going to ask you, when did I first contact you? Do you remember what year that was? 2003. Okay, in 10 years. Yeah. Yeah, Jim Sokol told me that. He said, Dawoud, it's been 10 years. Jim has the first email. Jim showed it to me, and it was 2003. But basically what I'm doing, you know, I'm always working on other projects. But with Birmingham, there was a real need. I needed to make something, but I didn't know what. I was in the midst of the Class Pictures Project, a group of American high school students, photographing first in Chicago, and then Detroit, and then San Francisco, and Orlando, Florida, New York. I was making other work even as I was trying my best to keep those conversations alive. And then if they didn't hear from me within a reasonable amount of time, it was usually Jim. Jim would send me an email. Hi, Dawoud. When you coming back? Your bedroom is ready and waiting for you. But it was about building relationships. You know, my first visit there, Jim Sokol, who's on the board of the Birmingham Museum of Art, probably on their contemporary committee. Jim was the one who fully embraced the project and became the connective tissue that kept me connected. And my second trip to Birmingham, he introduced me to Odessa Woolfolk. Odessa Woolfolk is the founder of, it hadn't even been built then, she's the founder of what became the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. She was a long-time activist in the civil rights movement, and Jim started making introductions. And people I would meet would give me suggestions. Odessa Woolfolk said, well, why don't you think about making portraits of some of the older civil rights movement people who are still alive? And I'm politely listening, knowing I don't want to do a documentary project. But conceptually, this was a real stretch for me to not only make portraits as I had been doing, but to make portraits as a way of visualizing this idea of the past and the present and the contemporary moment. And I didn't want to make anything until I could figure that out. But in the meantime, I was meeting people. I met Odessa Woolfolk. I met the minister of Bethel Baptist Church. Started spending time in the barber shop. Got to know this one barber, Don, very well. Just hanging out, meeting people, letting people know, yeah, I'm back. What's up? And I ain't been here for 6 months, brother, but what's going on? You know, let's catch up. Just to build relationships, to build. It's always, you know, photographing in communities is about building my own comfort level and being there. But probably more importantly, building a comfort level with people in the community about my now conspicuous presence. This guy from Chicago, he keep coming back. He must be the real deal. He keep coming back. You know, I think I like him. He keep coming back. Man, he been coming down here for 7 years. You know, and by then I would just go to the barber shop and sit in the chair and hang out. You know, I'm hanging out, but I'm also acutely aware of how old everyone is. I'm like, you look like he's 63. I don't say nothing. You know, just, you know, I'm thinking about the work. I'm thinking about the need to feel comfortable there, the need for people to see me, the need for people in the barber shop to know that I'm connected to Don. So I'm not here working for the police or whatever. You know, people don't know what you're doing. You're somebody who shows up with a camera, and all of a sudden you want to get all close and intimate and whatnot. Like, who are you? You know, so it has to be based on some very real relationship building. So that's basically what I was doing over that time, you know, building relationships. But keeping the conversation going and also trying to imagine, what am I going to make? The video was an idea I had because I wanted to, again, the multiple image. You know, the video, you know, I haven't spoken about the video, but the video is basically my imagining of that Sunday morning. See, there are 4 different paths on this side, and it was filmed in the 4 communities that the girls each lived in. So on this side, they're each heading towards the church. And then on the other side are 4 different social spaces that morning, because that morning was described as a bright blue fall morning. It was a beautiful morning before that happened. I wanted to make a piece about that morning. The barber shop's quiet. The barber shop represents a communal black social space where men gather. The beauty parlor, another black social space. And then you have the luncheonette, the lunch counter. We all know about the lunch counters in the South in the 60s, right? You know, the sit-ins. I don't know if any of you know, there are several photographs of black and white folks sitting in, having sugar poured over their head. That's what those sugar containers are about. I actually propped that and put them there, because this image I couldn't get out of my head of these folks sitting at the lunch counter having sugar just poured on themselves. And then the last one was a classroom, what would have been a segregated classroom. So these 4 different kinds of social spaces, all quiet, as they would have been that Sunday morning as the 4 girls head to church. And I filmed it from the vantage point of what would have been the way things look for a small child sitting in the back of the car. You're like looking up, you don't see everything down here, but you see the sky, you see the top of the houses going by, and everything is beautiful, but we know what comes after that. And so it ends with that moment before the moments that we do know. And once I said, you know, because I've made one other video piece that I completed, and I knew I wanted to try to continue to push that piece of my practice. So when I engage with the museums and they ask me, well, what do you want to do? I'll usually say something I don't even know how to do, because then I have to figure out how to do it. I say, I want to make a video. Okay, what space you want to put it in? Well, we have this video space in the back. What size is it going to be? 10 feet long. You know, you just start imagining the work. And then I knew I wanted it to be 2 different images, 2 separate. I wanted to show the girls moving towards church. I wanted to show the quietude of that morning. Ended up interviewing 3 different Birmingham-based film production companies, and ended up working with these guys that are 6'5".
Thank you, Dawoud. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you.